Welcome to the Ink to Film podcast, where we read the book.
And then see the movie.
I'm Luke.
And I'm James.
And this week we discuss Richard K. Morgan's 2002 post-cyberpunk novel, Altered Carbon. Now let's upload our cortical stacks and test out our new sleeves. So we've read the first half of Altered Carbon, and I don't know about you, James, but I have a ton to say about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating so far. It's a lot of fun. It's the kind of books that I really enjoy reading. I go out of my way to find this kind of stuff.
It goes beyond that for me. Like, Richard K. Morgan, just doing research into who he is and his novels, and we'll get into it in his bio stuff, but he's not only an author that I love to read, but he's the kind of author I want to be. This book is like, when I read this book, I had weird writer jealousy pangs of like, I wanted to write a novel like this.
Yeah.
And it's amazing. And I'm really impressed with it. And like I said, I have a lot to say about it, but I thought at first we'd just describe our podcast for people who might be checking it out for the first time. I'm a writer. James is a filmmaker. And we like to take projects that have been adapted into film and start out with the book, read the book, do a deep dive, talk about it at length, normally in multiple parts, and then we watch the adaptation, right, and talk about that.
Yeah, so far we've covered like a lot of great material, and like I'm looking forward to all the stuff coming up. We have a big stretch here of Sci-Fi, which I'm always a big fan of, so looking forward to it.
Yeah, you're right. This is the first in like a series of sci-fi projects I think we're going to end up doing. So normally we take like a scene by scene, chapter by chapter breakdown, and we talk about everything that happens in a novel, and then we discuss each scene at length. But that's what we like to do when we have, for our longer projects. But for this one, we're going to try something a little different. It's kind of experimental. We'd love to have feedback on what you think about it. But we're gonna talk about things in the first half of this episode in a really non-spoilery way. We're only going to reveal the kind of stuff that you would get from watching the trailer for the Netflix series that's coming out. So general like premise of the world, premise of the technology, and like the major characters.
Yeah, and like kind of give our thoughts on like how we felt about this first half so far without giving all the plot details away. Kind of talk about the aesthetic and how we feel about the writing, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and the philosophy and the tech, and I feel like there's a lot to talk about there. So we'll get all into that, and that's going to be, yes, there's minor spoilers there, but it's all stuff you get right at the beginning of the novel. So if you're listening to this to try and decide if you want to read this novel, the first half is going to be really good for that. Which, by the way, I think you should. I don't know if we've made that clear, but I really like this novel. I think the best way to experience it is to go read it, maybe use our Audible link to listen to it, like we did, and then you can listen to this podcast. But that's up to you. It's your decision.
Yeah, as far as basically what we're trying to say is the first half is going to be non-spoiler, so you can check it out and kind of get our thoughts on it without spoiling the show for you. And then the second half, I think we're going to dive more into kind of spoiler territory because it is a mystery, and we're going to get to what has unfolded so far briefly.
Yeah, the second half we're gonna dive into his investigation of this mystery, and we're gonna talk about we're gonna try and theorize on what we think is gonna happen in the second half of the novel, which we haven't read. So we haven't read the whole novel. We've only read half of it. Neither of us. And so that's something we normally talk about. But like, I have no experience with Richard K. Morgan up to this point, and I assume you don't either, right, James?
No, I've never read anything of his.
Yeah, so we're completely new to this, which isn't always the case. But yeah, that's how we're going to do this episode. So you're safe for, only minor spoilers in this first half. So before we get to that, I want to talk about Richard K. Morgan, the man, the author, the legend. I did some research on him, and there's some interesting things out there. I mean, he's pretty young. I think he's in his 50s. So he's an active guy right now in the industry. He has a little essay on his website that you can read that I'm going to talk about some of the highlights from. But if you want to read it yourself, I recommend it. He admits, like, he was born into privilege in England and attended college and was just kind of your regular bright but lazy kind of student. He got involved in some drug use, but just like minor, just like dope and stuff. And he also had like a big relationship, thing that made him all like emo, and he kind of talks about it in funny ways about how that kind of derailed him for a little while, and he thought he was never going to get over it. And then he ended up graduating, and he didn't even say what his degree was, but he said it was like kind of inconsequential. And then after his undergraduate, he decided he wanted to be a writer and he wanted to travel, was his like two passions in life. And he moved to London, where he was quickly like disabused of the idea that that is something that is particularly unique or special, that everybody wants to be a writer. And like, as soon as he got to London, he found that out. And that's something, all writers, I think, go through a little bit. I know I have. And then from there, he started teaching English as a foreign language. And through that, he traveled the world. And he lived in places like Istanbul and Madrid and Glasgow. And he went to all these different places, lived in them for a few years, teaching English. And all that time, he was writing. And he wrote a bunch of short stories and a screenplay and all this stuff. But he couldn't sell it. No, he couldn't publish anything. And then that all changed when he wrote Altered Carbon in 2002. Or right before that.
It's pretty interesting. He's kind of leading this, like, he's gone down a different path than a lot of the other authors, I feel like, that we've talked about so far.
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, everybody's different, everybody's got a different path, but his one resonates with me because, like, I get this. And so anyway, he wrote Altered Carbon, and he sold it to a publisher, and then immediately sold the movie rights to it for a reported $1 million. Which is a pretty amazing deal. And that's the kind of stuff that like dreams are made of right there. And then so he was able to quit his day job and works as a full-time writer. Since then, he's written a bunch of novels, a few more in this series, which I'm kind of hoping, if this Netflix 10-episode run is a success, maybe we'll see like book 2 will be season 2 or something. Who knows? We can get to that for the movie episode or the show episode. Yeah, but then he also writes dark fantasy. He has a series of dark fantasy novels, which if you know me, I love fantasy. So this is another reason why I'm kind of jealous of his career. Like, I want this career because he's able to write both sci-fi and fantasy, which is something I want to be able to do. And he has sold the rights for another of his novels, a standalone novel. But this is the first time that one of his novels is like hitting the screen. So it'll be interesting to see, because sometimes, if it's successful, Hollywood all of a sudden will start buying up books, right?
Yeah.
And another interesting note about him, first off, also this novel won the Philip K. Dick Award, which I thought was a nice little bit of symmetry, because we covered Blade Runner earlier. And for this novel to win that award is kind of funny.
In my opinion, there's a lot of parallels with Blade Runner. Well, I guess Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep was Philip K. Dick's novel. So there's a lot of parallels between the two here, and I'm sure we'll get more into that. But is it just a thing to have K as your middle initial when you're a sci-fi writer, or is that like a unwritten rule?
Maybe I need to add a K in there. People always joke about RR for fantasy. Like if you're a fantasy writer, it's George R.R. Martin, J.R.R. Tolkien.
Yeah.
And maybe Philip K. Dick, Richard
Just
K. Morgan.
Make your middle initials RKR.
Yeah, there you go. Luke RKR Elliott. I like it. So he's also won the Arthur C. Clarke Award and the John W. Campbell Award, which is another nice bit of symmetry for our podcast, because we cover John W. Campbell's Who Goes There for the Thing episodes. And then recently, he's written some comics for under the Marvel Knights imprint, specifically Black Widow: Homecoming and Black Widow: The Things They Say About Her. And I know you're a big comics guy. Have you read any of that?
No, I haven't. I haven't read either of those. But it's cool that he's done that, diversifying.
And then he's also the lead writer for the 2011 video game Crysis 2.
Nice.
Which I don't know if you remember that game.
I remember Crysis, yeah.
Yeah. So he's writing comics, writing video. He's the lead writer for a video game. I think he's working on another video game. He writes novels in both sci-fi and fantasy. I'm telling you, this guy's career is the career I want. You know what I mean? Like this is it's pretty awesome. So I'm jealous of Richard K. Morgan, and he's a great writer too. Which I think we're ready to get into the novel now, right?
Yeah. I was going to say that, particularly like the fact that he was, like, from what I gather, he was somewhat like not officially trained in writing, and it seems like he has a pretty good grasp on it. He has his own voice that's like pretty distinct, I feel like.
Yeah, I mean, he might have studied English. I'm not really sure. And then, English as a foreign language forces, if you're teaching English, you're gonna be around words and language. And so I think over those 14 years he worked doing that, I think he probably conditioned himself and taught himself to be the writer that he is. So not only is Richard K. Morgan, someone who I really admire just from already, but this novel. And this isn't going to be the experience for everyone, but this novel feels like a laser-guided missile aimed at me. It's amazing. Like, I'm like, this novel is made for me, and I almost feel guilty about it because I know that someone else might not have the same experience.
Yeah.
But someone who is skeptical about religion, someone who is really into future tech and futurism, someone who is kind of can be nihilistic at times, or just a little bit more interested in like grim writing and I don't know, that like stylized future stuff is really cool to me, and just like everything about this novel, and then just the idea of popping in and out of bodies and this like tech soul that this book is about. It's just really cool, and it hits home in like the best possible way for me.
I mentioned earlier that it kind of reminds me of Blade Runner or
absolutely.
Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? And I'm sure it's super inspired by that, because I'm sure he loves that film. But it feels much more tight as a story compared to Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. And it's also like, it's got this like perfect plot where it's like, there are fun, interesting action beats. There are times that let you breathe. There are philosophical moments. There are religious like inquiries, kind of. They're just thinking about like what would happen in these future times, but like, so all of it is so believable to me. Like, all of it seems like a natural progression of technology through the like what we can see projected across however many 100 years, 200 years. And we'll get more into the actual tech, but like something that I thought was fascinating was the idea of the uploading your digital consciousness and how that can travel almost instantaneously versus physical matter to transport that across large like distances. Like that's like the ultimate thing to crack is sending a physical thing faster than light speed. Will we ever crack that? Will that ever be feasible? I don't know. It's wild.
Yeah, that it's definitely super theoretical. That stuff that goes on, and I'm not really sure the science behind it. But it's really interesting, and it raises a lot of philosophical questions, which I find more interesting. But before we get into that, I mean, this novel is described as a post-cyberpunk novel, whereas Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep is almost a proto-cyberpunk novel. So we've kind of come around, and I think the main difference from what I understand is that in post-cyberpunk novels, the future described tends to be a lot more connected, maybe a little bit less dystopian, and a little bit more of a functioning society. And I do think we get that here. Like, this is a society. This is a, spanning multiple worlds. You could look at it as grim and like kind of dark in certain ways, but it's not dystopian. You know what I mean? Like, it's not, the world hasn't really ended or anything.
Right.
It's ongoing. And so that is a marked difference, I think, in a lot of that kind of fiction. And, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, I think, is more like apocalyptic almost.
Definitely.
But yeah, let's get into specifics. Let's talk about, I mean, we've talked a lot about the tech, but I think we need to like establish that for people who haven't read this book and haven't maybe even seen the trailer. You need to know what this tech is.
This is, again, going to be our light, very, very light spoilers, just kind of talk it through and tell you the basis of this story.
Right. All right, so you're gonna help me with this, James.
Yeah, let's do this.
Because I want to make sure I get. There's a lot of details. There's a lot that gets thrown at you very early in this novel.
Yeah, it's dense.
Yeah. So when you first meet Takeshi Kovacs, which is our main character, he is with another woman named Sarah, and they get killed in the opening prologue. Now that's in the opening prologue. So like I said, light spoiler, but literally this is the first thing you'll read about when you pick up the book. But they're not really, he's not really dead, and that's the whole premise of the book. So what happens is, in this world, there's a tech that enables your consciousness to get transferred from body to body. And it's the piece of tech that goes into like the base of your skull called a cortical stack, right?
Right.
And so they are able to take his stack out of that dead body and put it into some sort of storage, and then he gets shipped to Earth. And I'm not really sure as to the reasons why. I'm not sure that he really understands them. Did you quite get why he in particular is just like, does Bancroft just choose him? Why is he in particular brought to Earth?
I won't get too spoiler heavy, but basically I think from the context clues that we get after the fact, they kind of push this all on us and then expect us to play catch up. So right. What we kind of figure out is that he is like this ex-soldier who is brought up in this military army where they get like cybernetic
envoys.
Yes.
Right.
Envoy is what it's called. It's like envoy. So they're basically just like military special forces kind of, and they get these like enhancements, whether it's like reaction time or combat or whatever it is. They have all these different enhancements. So that makes him like somebody who would be good in. Some of
that is tied to the bodies that they're in, but they get trained with like a certain amount of training that is, I think it's very psychological, and they bring that with them to whatever sleeve they're in, which, by the way, that's the term they use for different bodies.
Right.
Their sleeves.
So yeah, you're right. It's more like built into it's something that they're brought up with, and they bring that from sleeve to sleeve. So right. He was like brought up, and he's like has all these great investigating techniques and all this stuff. And so I guess that what we're supposed to draw from the prologue is that they were caught up in this crime because he was an ex-soldier, and with all these skills, the best thing he could do basically was become a criminal. So he and whoever he was with, his companion, they both died. I think we're supposed to assume that they were together in some way.
Yeah, romantically linked in some way, but we don't know. I think it's safe to say we don't really know the details of what he was doing, like what kind of criminal behavior he may or may not have been involved in, and like all of that's very vague.
That's how it comes back to Bancroft. Is he kind of uses Bancroft as this older man, and we'll dive more into this, but basically I just want to say. Bancroft brought him back because what happens is if you commit a crime, rather than locking you up in your physical body, they lock you up in your cortical stack in this thing called the stack. So they put you away basically in like virtual prison basically. So you right. hang out there for however long. And Bancroft is a really wealthy man. So he goes and uses his influence and his power to pull this person who has all these skills out of that jail basically.
Right. And so that's our premise for like when he wakes up in a new sleeve. So I think it's also important to note, now I don't know if it's his original, like his born body, or if it's a sleeve he's in at the time, but it seems like he is, basically an Asian man living on another world, which is called Harlan's world.
Yes.
And I'm not sure where Harlan's world is. I'm not sure if it's in our solar system or maybe even in another solar system. I kind of thought maybe it was in a different star system.
I think we get the implication that it's light years away, I think they said.
Yeah. So that's interesting, and he had some sort of long journey over, it seems like. But yeah, so he wakes up in this new sleeve, which is a 40-ish year old white guy, and this new body he's in has all these neurochems, which are automated. And so if he senses danger, like they start pouring into his body, and it makes him have like really heightened reflexes and, calmness under pressure and under stress. And it reduces his like reaction to that kind of stimuli. It's really interesting. It's like the body he's in is this pretty well oiled fighting type body that's really well equipped for the things he's going to do. Seemingly that's why he's in this body, right? Like it's a body that's well equipped. And so you also get the implication that the bodies people are put into often have pre-existing histories, which I think is also important. Mm-hmm. They're not just like a lab-grown body that has never done anything.
Well, in most cases, but in some cases,
yeah.
Exactly.
There are exceptions to all this because it gets crazy, but most of the time you get into a sleeve, and that for some reason someone has maybe gotten in trouble. And so now they're on the stack, right? Like they're in storage. And so their body's just sitting there. And when that happens, your body can be loaned out essentially. And he literally has a lease agreement on this body he's in for 6 weeks. which I think is also really funny. So he's like leasing this body. And so there's this whole fun stuff where he's like having to get accustomed to this new body. I feel like we could talk about that forever, but at its core, it's about these consciousnesses that can get transferred body to body via this device.
It's basically like there's also, it's like kind of the major stack can be seen as like the cloud. So it's like your consciousness can be pulled out of the cloud, put into a body.
Yeah. Although it seems to typically be a physical, like it's a physical like chip they have to like retrieve from a body and bring it somewhere and stuff. But then there is like, if you're more wealthy, there's a way to do it more remotely.
Yes.
Which we'll get into with Bancroft. But typically it's analog.
Right. So if you want to say like the reason why Bancroft brought him back and the reason for the mystery.
Yeah, so Bancroft we meet next. That's the first person he really meets, other than he meets Kristen Ortega, who's a detective who kind of is there to take him to meet Bancroft.
She's a major player. Like she shows up a lot. We'll talk about her more.
Yeah, she's important. So he meets Bancroft and his wife Miriam, but Bancroft is the heart of this mystery. So what has happened with Bancroft is he died, and he says, "You're here to investigate my murder." And his murder was investigated by the police, but they ruled it a suicide. But he doesn't believe it. And the way that he's able to still be there and standing in front of him is because he's super rich. He has these, he has like a 48-hour upload. Every 48 hours, his consciousness, his person gets uploaded into a backup storage facility. And then if in the event of his death, he will wake up in a new sleeve, but he loses whatever time since that last update. And we find out that he was murdered right before he was about to be backed up again. So almost 48 hours of just like unaccounted for time. Something happened. He ends up getting killed. And the person who killed him like blew off his brain and fried it and whatever and like blew up his stack and everything. So if you were a less wealthy person, that's what they call real death. But he's able to avoid that because of his wealth.
Because of the backup. Well, so we should also reiterate the fact that like if your body, so say you're not very wealthy, if you're shot in like the heart, say, someone can come and retrieve your stack, your cortical stack, and upload you and then get you into a new sleeve. But if your neck, if in the bottom of your skull, if that's destroyed, like you're saying, it's the real death.
Yeah. Yeah, and unless you've had some sort of backup, which only the really wealthy seem to be able to afford, then you're just dead. And that's, yeah. And it seems like that's a lot more rare now. Even people who can't afford it, like the government takes their stacks and just puts it on storage. It's like they don't actually die. So often you'll hear about people dying and they just can't afford to get a new sleeve. So they're just kind of permanently on storage.
Right.
Which has interesting implications.
Yeah, and brings up so many like Black Mirror episode type things that are going on in the stack, and I don't know.
Yeah. So the important thing to know about Bancroft is he is over 250 years old. And he has lived out like multiple lives, and he grows new versions of his body to inhabit that he just like swaps in and out of. And because he's so wealthy, like he can do all of this. And they call these types of people meths, which is a really cool term that's referring to Methuselah from like the Bible. Mm-hmm. And it's essentially that they're so old that they almost become another type of person because they have accrued all this power and wisdom and knowledge that the implication is that they start seeing other people as lesser than them, and they kind of see themselves as like demigods. Right. And you can get why. Because he essentially can't be killed, and he is supremely wealthy, and he's lived for all these multiple lives and all this stuff. So he's this really interesting, fascinating character that I was immediately taken with, even though he's questionable at some, in a lot of ways. But he's the heart of this mystery. He wants to know how he died, and he thinks someone's trying to kill him permanently. But the police don't want to deal with it because they think that, first off, they also are kind of prejudiced against these types of people, these old types of people, the meths. And second off, they just think that he, for whatever weird, zany reason, killed himself and just doesn't realize it.
Yeah, and they also kind of figure even if he didn't kill himself, if someone else killed him, he's still here. So like whatever. Like, you're still
Yeah,
here,
like,
so
what's
what's
the
the
big
point
deal?
of like wasting manpower on this when real like actual people are dying?
We get most of this from Kristen Ortega, and that's her reasoning. And yeah, she wants to go investigate people who can't afford to have a backup. You know what I mean? Like, there are people who are having real deaths out there that she could better spend her time investigating. But anyway, so he draws up this deal with Kovacs that he will be get a new sleeve of his choosing, and he'll get like 100,000 credits, which is is apparently a ton. And his sentence will be like done, and he'll basically get a new lease on life if he is able to solve this murder. If he's not able to solve it, he has to essentially just go back to storage. So he doesn't really have like much of a choice at all.
Yeah. Some people who are in storage are just on ice basically till they can get a new sleeve, and then others, like I think he had like a 200-year sentence that was cut short because of Bancroft, like kind of pulled him out. So if he does have to go back, he has to serve like a couple hundred more years on the stack without coming back out.
Yeah, that's the premise. I think that's the essential premise, and then it's trying to figure out who done it.
Right.
I think it's important to note that Miriam, his wife, Bancroft's wife, is just like him. Also really ancient. She's when Kovacs meets her, she's in this like teenager body, but she's actually several hundred years old, just like Bancroft himself.
Yeah.
And they have this really like weird kind of interesting relationship where they only see each other like briefly and are very like business-like almost. There's a lot going on, and I guess I don't want to get into it because it could be spoilery, but we get an implication that Bancroft isn't necessarily telling him everything, and Kovacs feels like he's partly curious and partly because he doesn't have any choice. He agrees to take on this investigation. So the other thing we didn't mention is that this is back on Earth, importantly.
Yes.
Which Kovacs has like never been to. So he's also this interesting like fish out of water, which gives us a cool entry point into this world because he doesn't know a lot about Earth, and so he is able to say he's naive, and they have to explain to him things about like how life is on Earth, which is a nice entry point for the reader because we don't know what life is like on Earth now at this point either.
Yeah.
So it's like a clever way of giving us a lot of information.
Definitely.
And so he's in they call it Bay City, and I think it's supposed to be basically San Francisco, right? Because he goes to Alcatraz at one point.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Which it's also cool because Richard K. Morgan is a Brit, so it's interesting that he chose San Francisco as his place to set this novel.
Yeah.
So you extrapolate out from this core premise of the sleeves, and you get the haves and the have-nots, and you get society as a whole, and how that's affected everything. And people's ability to afford a new body becomes a huge factor in their ability to succeed. And in some ways, like, disease and death has been conquered, but there is still always the risk of the real death if your stack were to get destroyed.
So I mean, more than anything, we still have the same problems where we have the super rich, super powerful 1%, and then everyone else. It's showing like the difference in wealth and how like it extrapolates out, and it becomes more important as we go further into the future, because as we cure these diseases and as we cure all these things, there's ways for you to continue on. And like, it made me realize that like, damn, if I was coming up in this time, I would be like, you would do whatever you could to be rich. You know what I mean? You would do everything you could to live that life.
Well, unless you were like the Catholics, which
exactly.
I thought was a really funny moment because they're considered this like fringe religious sect, and Kovacs has never heard of them. He's like, who are they? The Catholics? They sound like crazy people because they don't believe in using this whole technology at all. They think that when you die, you just should die and you shouldn't upload to another sleeve. And they have it like built into they take this like vow, and there's laws against actually re-sleeving them or bringing them back. So they opt out of this scenario, and they're kind of viewed as being kooky, like fringe, almost cultists, which is, I don't know, I thought it was fun. It was someone who was raised Catholic, I should say.
Well, it's also cool because it's like you get this because there's sort of like political maneuvering going on, and like the people are trying to change laws to make it so that like it's either they're dealing with like the whole Catholic thing, because it's literally baked into the law, where it's like, if you're Catholic, don't bring them back. So kind of like people know that they can get away with killing certain Catholics, and it just becomes like part of the mystery of it all.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, if you could fake someone being a Catholic, that could be a way to keep people from being able to bring, because like, you could murder someone, and as long as you don't destroy their stack, the police can revive them and give them what they call like synthetic sleeves or temporary sleeves, and bring them back and talk to them and find out what they know. There's also a whole virtual reality component and all this stuff, and there's androids, and it's a full-fledged future world with AI and all this cool stuff. So the only other non-spoiler stuff I wanted to get into is just, I wanted to talk to you about what your take is on this tech, and I just came back to this core question: would you do it?
Yeah, which we actually talked about before recording, and we think that we may make this like a somewhat frequent little segment. So this will be our "Would you do it" segment.
Yeah, would you do it?
So
music, I don't know.
I mean, there's a lot of variables to think about. It's like,
sure. So
how
I think
well off
at
am
its
I?
base, would you opt into the having a cortical stack that can be put into another body? That's the first. Would you do that?
I mean, yes, yeah, for sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Same. I absolutely would do that. I think not only that, I think it's a believable path that our tech could bring us to. I don't know how far out it is. This, I should say also, this is like far future, this story. But I absolutely would do it.
Yeah, I mean, at its core, you would definitely do it, and then then certain variables come into play, because sometimes you don't really have a choice which sleeve you end up in after your first death.
Now, so the idea of uploading consciousness, and we don't have time to really get into this, but at first blush, it seems like a no-brainer. Okay, yeah, you just take the information of my brain and you upload it to a computer. But what does that actually mean? And how do you know that the thing that is uploaded is actually you right now and not a copy, and that you right now actually die?
Right. That's like the same idea behind like beaming someone up in Star Trek, right?
Right.
It's like, are they completely pulling them apart at the material level and then copying them there? And so did that version of yourself die, but every memory, every feeling, everything that you have reappear in that other person. So you effectively die, but you carry on in this new version.
So every time that happens, is it just a copy of you?
Right.
And people like, does that copy lose anything? And because it's identical to you, does it matter?
Yeah. So
I think it's really interesting philosophical thing to talk about, because there's no good answer for that. I don't think.
Well, I guess it's one of those things where it's like, once we get there and people experience it, but then I guess the person on the other end would be like, no, I'm still the same person as I was. So you never really have proof. Because that new person, this also goes to, I mean, it's a spoiler, I guess, for The Prestige, but that movie's been out a long time. But are we ever going to cover The Prestige? Is that a novel?
Yeah, that is a novel, actually.
All right, we'll save that then. We'll put that on ice.
There's some similar things, is all I'm going to say. Yeah. If you've seen the movie, you know what I'm talking about. But yeah, so is the person in that stack, is that a copy of you, or is that you? Becomes the essential question. And does it matter?
I mean, how I feel about it before this technology comes out, I feel like I would be worried. That would be the worry, right? Because the first time you would be like, okay, well, you're jumping into the unknown. You're taking that leap of faith and hoping that it all works out, and that's still your soul per se connected to that brain.
Well, that's what we're talking about, right? Like it's basically the concept of a soul,
right? And
is that a real thing? And does that transfer into the tech, or is that something that dies with your physical body?
Yeah, it's tough to say. I feel like I would be weary of being like really nonchalant about. I would have the cortical stack just because, like, if something happened with this body that I have here, I would want that backup regardless. Yeah. But
it's something, right?
I wouldn't be gung ho. I wouldn't be trying to die to jump into the next sleeve, because you're still entering the unknown. I
think, when I first thought about this, I thought the stack is oh, of course I would do that. That's no big deal. That's you, right? It's a physical thing that transfers. But that doesn't actually matter, because when I was thinking about it, I was like, the remote thing that we find out that Bancroft does, where he sends his consciousness to another world, which is then loaded into a clone. That I was like, oh, he just died. And you know what I mean? Like I thought of it more like that was my breaking point. I couldn't do that because it's not the same physical item.
Right.
That's just a copy. But ultimately that doesn't matter, because it's the point from biological to digital. It's that cortical stack in your body has to at some point copy or transcribe what's going on in your brain that makes you into some sort of information packet. And that information packet right there, so to me, that's the real barrier. And once I got past that, like, maybe it's new me now, maybe it's digital me now. But
Yep.
once digital me exists, I feel like at that point I wouldn't care anymore. And at that point I'd be bought in.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you die every time, but I've already died, so that's, at that point I'd be like, beam me across, I don't care.
Yeah.
But we could also be looking at some ancient copy of a real person that used to live, if you think of it that way, which is kind of creepy.
Yeah. It's all really crazy. Like something that I wanted to mention, it's not really spoilers, just as the detail that was in it was that all of the wars that have been won in this universe, like more recently, have been basically just a bunch of soldiers. Their consciousness were just uploaded into a bunch of available sleeves that were nearby. So they effectively are just like this like beamable army, this beamable group that just like you can just shoot the consciousness of somebody into a body light years away or whatever, and then they're there. And I just really, really cool concepts that I'd never really thought of before.
And it blurs the line. Like, what does artificial intelligence even mean if everybody is just essentially a chip in a body anyway?
Yeah.
You essentially, at that point, you are artificial intelligence. How are you any different?
Like you said, you are artificial. As soon as you die that first time, and whether you're in the cortical stack or you're uploaded virtually or however that was digitally, regardless, you are artificially intelligent at that point.
Yeah. So it's interesting because they have these AIs. Like, importantly, he goes to a hotel that is run by an AI, and it's not a spoiler to say that, but I won't get into what happens. But I was thinking, like, he's not really any different than that hotel in a lot of ways. Now, maybe the difference is in the programming, and AIs have more restrictive programming, whereas if you're in one of these cortical stacks, you have the freedom to do what you want. You're given like more free will than maybe a more particular AI is given. But other than that, like, they're pretty similar.
Yeah.
So I mean, I guess we should probably get into some spoilers now. Do you have anything else you want to talk about in this non-spoiler section?
Something that I thought was interesting is I think this is our first-person POV novel, right?
Oh, yes, I think it is.
Because I thought it was interesting. Like right away, it's all eyes. Like I did this, I did that, and I was like, wow, it's really smart to do it that way. But we also get that third person sometimes.
That, and that reminds me, I have two follow-ups to that. First, I want to ask you, how did that affect, like, how did you like that as a difference? Like, did you find anything fundamentally different about being in first person to being in a close third person?
I mean, I think first person I like first person because you're able to get like very, very specific, like intimate thoughts that like you can get that in close third, but it's like to be like, I feel this way. I remember this. There's like some flashbacks that we get. And I feel like I'm usually closer to first person, but I will say that I've read first person novels before that I didn't like necessarily as much as close third. So like, I guess what I'm saying is it's hard to get it right.
Yeah. Well, I think what you're saying is in the right hands,
it
can be something that takes something where you're already really, like, you would already be really close and close third, but it just maybe adds just a little bit of something else to have it be I. And I would say on the writer side of things, some writers find it easier to get into their characters' heads if they do it that way, if they use first person. So it can be a tool in the writer's toolbox to get close to their character.
Yeah.
I don't know. I can't speak for him as to why he chose that. But I do think it's cool in this novel where identity is so transient. I think it gives you kind of an anchor, and that we know who we are in this novel. Mm-hmm. We know we're Takeshi Kovacs, and no matter what happens to him and what, you know what I mean? Like, we always know we're him.
Right.
And so that also wanted me to bring up one more philosophical thing about this that I think is really interesting, is the idea of identity and like what makes us who we are. And I immediately by definition it becomes kind of political, but like I immediately think of gender identity politics, right? And it's so obvious here because Takashi we consider him a male, right? We consider him a man, mm-hmm. but he can be sleeved into a woman's body. Mm-hmm. And so if you're a man sleeved into a woman's body, what are you then? Are you a woman or are you a man?
It's whatever you identify as.
Right. It's what you identify as.
Right.
It's what you believe you are. It's your identity.
Exactly.
And so that is a really clear way for you to understand that, I think. Mm-hmm. And that I think you can see what it's like for him. He is a man in a woman's body in that moment. But he's no longer a man. He just has these female characteristics, physical characteristics.
Yeah. And
so I think, and you could take that beyond gender to just everything. Like, your identity is almost separate from your physical body, mm-hmm. in a way that people don't, I think, appreciate in our society enough.
Yeah. No, I get that. Yeah, it's definitely. I felt that too. Like when they were diving into that, I went down this whole rabbit hole where I was like, well, this is this, and I definitely got a lot of that where it was like, this could be a good touchstone for people who aren't really able to wrap their head around the concept, because it's like, it really is like, it's like if you identify a certain way, that is who you are. You know what I mean? Regardless of what you were born into or how you know what I mean? It's just, I don't know. It's very interesting, and relevant. It just seems like I want to give some people this story and be like, here, this is a good way to understand this.
Well, and you could talk about race too, right? Mm-hmm. Now it's interesting that I think it works better in a novel maybe than it will on screen. I'm curious to see how they approach it, but it's a man who's a minority is in a white dude for this novel, mm-hmm. for most of it at least. But it's interesting because like at his heart, is he like, what does he identify as? And is that what's important more than his outward appearance? And yeah, so you can take that to mean all kinds of things. It's just really interesting too. And like, what does that mean for any of us? I don't know. It's like, to me, it harkens to the way I view the world, and that is, people are just people and we're all the same, but we're in these bodies that society tells us mean certain things about us, but really we're just consciousnesses that are more alike with one another than dissimilar in any way, and we're just in bodies.
Yeah.
I don't know.
It's just weird because it's like, as humans and as society more than anything, we do this grouping thing where we just like society decides this group is like you were saying, we're much closer to each other than anything else on the planet. You know what I mean? And yet we still decide that like this person is in this group and this person is in this group, where it's like we can't like take that macro view and just be like, we're all individually people, and like you say, it's tough.
It's just your meat sack.
Exactly.
It's just your sleeve, man.
Just my vessel.
It's a really cool metaphor for all that, if you want to take it that way. But beyond just being a metaphor, like, this is some shit that we might actually get into at some point in our future if we survive. So really fascinating novel. And that's one of the reasons it's blowing me away. Like, it's so much to think about. There's so much there you can chew on, and I highly recommend it. But I think just based on time alone, we need to get to our spoiler section.
Yeah.
But before we do that, we wanted to take a second and tell you about Audible.
So Audible has been nice enough to give us an affiliate link. It's audibletrial.com/ink2film. And with that, you get 30 free days to their service and 1 free audiobook in their collection.
Yeah, and I was talking to somebody recently, and I wanted to make sure we make this clear. So when you sign up for Audible, you are getting a free book, and yes, they will charge you after 30 days. But it's not like it's just a delayed charge for that book. What it is you get a free book, and then at the start of the second month, you get another book. You get another credit. So when the first time you get paid, you get charged, you are getting a second novel. So don't think, you know what I mean? Think of it that way. That first month is free, and you get a free book. Second month you get charged, but you get another novel.
Right. So basically every month you get a book.
Yeah, and you can cancel at any time.
Right.
So if you don't want, you know what I mean? So keep that in mind. I'm going to go ahead and recommend Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. Not only because we've covered it and you can listen to us talk about it and compare it to this work, but I think this novel owes a lot to that. And if you haven't read it, I think it's a really good way to like steep yourself in sort of the history of the genre of cyberpunk and a really foundational novel, I think, for the genre.
Definitely. I mean, it's so like you can see the groundwork being laid.
Yeah, and that's by Philip K. Dick. Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. If you wanted to get that novel, just go to audibletrial.com/ink to film, and you'll get it for free. And you can listen to that and then listen to our episodes about it too if you want. And that would help us out a ton. All right, so this is the spoiler section. We're going to talk about anything and everything is fair game for what happened. I think what we're going to try and do, instead of our typical scene by scene, we're going to talk about the investigation in kind of broad terms. And then if we want to talk about any specifics, or if James, if you have any scenes you want to talk about specifically, we'll dive into them. So Takeshi, he starts his investigation, and he really goes down this rabbit hole of finding out about prostitutes that Bancroft has had dealings with. He gets dropped a name, Lila, which he comes to find out is a woman that may or may not have been impregnated by Bancroft. It's a mystery, but the implication is that maybe she was. And then Miriam, Bancroft's wife, forced a miscarriage on her by beating her up. And then she got paid like hush money. And so this is like the first of several things it's really about Takeshi unearthing a lot of like things about the Bancroft family.
And also dealing with the fact that Bancroft didn't tell him any of this prior to the investigation. So it's making Bancroft seem a little like he is covering something up, or they're covering something up, or it just seems like he's not being completely truthful.
Yeah, it seems like maybe Bancroft is naively believing that it doesn't have anything to do with this, or this isn't important, which we get the impression of this has to be somehow important, right? In at least understanding the kind of person he is. Now, some things happen during this investigation. He, for one, someone tries to abduct him early on when he's at the Hendrix. And the Hendrix has like an automated system that kills the guy who's trying to, or it's a pair of people who are trying to kidnap him.
And the Hendrix being the hotel that the automated AI hotel.
Right, which, by the way, he goes to the watchtower room, which I thought was just a really cool, Jimmy,
all along the watchtower, yeah.
All along the watchtower, yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, reference is what I'm trying to say. So that we come to find out that the person who tried to abduct him is this like really famous hitman who like makes copies of himself illegally and pairs up with himself. So the two people, it was a woman and a man, were actually the same person, which is a really interesting other thing that gets opened up.
I was going down that rabbit hole. That's something else that I was thinking about. I was like, all right, so if you can upload your consciousnesses, I mean, you can be in two bodies at once. Is that, Are you able to...
Which one are you? Are you
both? You're obviously like individuals, but like you work together, I'm assuming, and I don't know, went down a whole path of like, what if you were in a female body and a male body, had sex with yourself, had a child? Like, what does this do to like all of these things? Like,
I didn't get to the child part, but yeah, you're right.
It's like, what does that do to a child? And it's just all of this stuff, all the way down.
Well, and I think that's going to be tied to the sleeve you're in, but it seems like people are also copying their actual sleeves. Now, but then you would always be the same sex. Like later on, Miriam has a buck wild sex scene with our main character. Yep. And at the end, she like promises him this like sexual fantasy of he can go live on this island where she has just like numerous copies of herself that are all there to just please him.
Which makes her seem extremely suspicious.
Yes,
she's
I
like,
agree.
she's like, you'll be there for a very long time, and you're like, oh, so you want this investigation to go poorly?
Well, and she even says like, I want you to stop this investigation, which is the one thing that makes her seem less suspicious almost, because she's at least like, she doesn't hide the fact that she wants him to stop investigating it.
Right.
I don't know what to make of Miriam. She is definitely a potential suspect. And she's also one of these meths, right? So she's been around for hundreds of years, and I think our main character is getting distracted by her, sexuality, and often maybe not thinking clearly around her.
I also wanted to mention that, like, just dealing with all of the Miriam stuff, I felt like there was some stuff that was like there's some almost fairly problematic ways that she was being like interpreted as far as it goes. And I know it's like, this book's like what, like almost 20 years old now, 15, 16. But it's just like, there's some of it where it was like extremely objectifying, and like, I get that like it's part of like what the character is supposed to, what he's trying to like portray with this character, but it was like a lot. And it's like, maybe it's like obviously he's not saying that this is how he feels about women. It's this character and what it just I was like, there were some parts I was like, ooh.
Well, I think, you could say that someone could read this and find it to be too much, be too explicit. Absolutely, that could happen, and maybe even be a little bit offensive. But I think he is also trying to get at, there's themes in this book about kind of like our base nature, and how, you look at Bancroft and he talks about this at length, where he has this, like, he calls it like the flesh has these like, desires, which, that's a well trodden trope. But that's why he sleeps with prostitutes, is he respects his wife too much to be like really like dirty with her. So he goes and sleeps with all these prostitutes and does his like carries out his fantasies. But that is all part of this idea of humanity has this like perversion that, and like sex is a big part of this novel. And so I think he's also trying to highlight that, like, that's, I think, going to become a big part of the motivation for what my theory is, something that, for why Bancroft was killed. It's going to be tied up in this sex stuff somehow. Right. And that's my theory, at least. And I think it's because thematically it makes sense for this novel. And then, we get a lot of talk about, he isn't necessarily in his head, or in his stack, like super horny, but he gets put in a body that is super horny. Right. And so he's like a slave to his sleeve's desires, which is also really interesting too, right?
Well, they talk about the nicotine addiction and smoking cigarettes, and how he's trying to quit.
Which is another example of that.
Exactly.
And so I think we're supposed to get that, like, his body is just super horny, and that's when he sees this woman, like, he can't help it. Like, that's just how his body reacts to it. Yeah. And he draws it up in really explicit ways, for sure. And then, like, the sex scene is so explicit in and of itself, I think, for a similar reason, right?
Well, the sex scene is less, I felt less problematic because it's more of like a mutual thing. Yeah. And it was just like specifically like objectifying before. But I mean, like,
you could also argue that Miriam wants that. I think is also the point. Like, there's a reason she isn't in a, pantsuit, like middle-aged woman. She could be like that, but she's not. She's in a teenager's body that is, hypersexualized. She obviously wants this sort of attention. Now, is that problematic to say? I don't know. Maybe don't extrapolate out to the real world. What I'm talking about is a character who's multiple centuries old, who has any option she wants. She doesn't have to be this way, but she is choosing to be this way. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I don't know. I think it seems a little messy, but I definitely get what you're saying.
Like, yeah, I don't know. It's interesting because, like, I don't know how much of it's like he's trying to say something about the world and how much of it is just important for the plot of this novel. And I don't know. But then, people can hop in, so some of this gender stuff becomes really fluid because you can hop in and out of different bodies, and like you can become a woman and experience sex that way if you want, and like all this stuff. Yeah. So, and then there's some really interesting stuff later where he talks about how like women are really what the species is, and like men are almost like a offshoot of that, and how they're just like fucking and fighting machines. Yeah. But like the real experience is when you're in a woman's body, and like you're like they're more sensory and all this stuff. And it's really interesting. Like, I don't know how true that is because I'm not a woman, but like I'm assuming this is based off of his conversations, and like it. I believe it.
Yeah, I mean, and we're gonna get to definitely a scene where we deal with some of this stuff. So let's jump ahead to like that kind of stuff.
Yeah, let's do it. So he also finds out about a death threat that's been made in the specific way that Bancroft was killed, and he decides to investigate that. And he meets a man who does want Bancroft dead, but he says that he didn't actually do it. And we find out about this man's daughter, who is another prostitute who was involved with Bancroft and then died mysteriously. And so Takeshi kind of follows this down a path which leads him to this whorehouse called Jerry's.
Jerry's, yeah.
And yeah, there he talks to another prostitute, and he asks her about the daughter, whose name is Elizabeth, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And when he's asking her about Elizabeth, he poses as her mother, who's been put into the body he's in, which is really funny and just cool.
I thought that was great. Yeah, I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, he convinces her that he's actually this girl's mother. I don't know, it's really cool. And then yeah, he ends up coming back later, and when he returns later, the prostitute, he goes to see her again, and she gets murdered, and he gets abducted and taken to this clinic where he's tortured, which is another crazy.
Well, before he's tortured, he's like, they knock him out basically as soon as he gets to the clinic, and he wakes up in a female body.
Right, and there you go. So now he's in a female body, and it's a female body that hasn't been augmented in any way, isn't very strong at all, and even though he has his reflexes and he has his training, he's at the whims of what's happening. Now what's weird is that he's like kind of in this body, but he's also kind of in virtual reality, and like there's a really interesting blurring that happens with that.
Yeah.
And I wasn't quite sure, like, is he actually ever in a real physical body, or is he just his stack experiencing
That's
things?
what I was going to say. Is so at the end of the scene, I feel like we get the implication that it was just a virtual like thing that they put him through. Like maybe he was in the process of being put into a different body, but they were giving him this experience because they talk about the fact that like death isn't a factor anymore. And basically the way that you hurt someone is you either put them on the stack and make them wait and like lose years just going by on the stack, or you torture them and tear them apart because death is too quick. So, and that's what happens to him, whether this was virtual or not. He experienced this.
He experiences it as if it is. And I think the blending is probably important because it kind of shows how to him it is real regardless. And so, yeah, he's tortured brutally, which I don't want to get into too many of the details of that, but he's essentially he's being tortured brutally. And then he, through his training, is able to stop his own heart and kill himself to spare himself future pain, which I thought was really interesting that's like something really cool that he's able to do with his training.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, this is where we were talking about the sensory of being a female and how they experience pleasure differently and pain differently, and the thresholds that comes with that, and menstruation and childbirth and all of that. And but when you say brutal, like this was a brutal scene. Like she was like torn apart, and just like obviously the worst part of it had to be she was impaled in her vagina, and the rod that's
nervous laughter, by the way. That's why I laughed.
The rod that was in there was unbelievably like torturous, and I don't know, man. That was another point where I was like, I understand the shock value, and I'm all for that in stories. It was just like, whoo, that was pretty far, man. You went almost as far as you could go. Anyway, this rod is being warmed up by some element or something, and basically she's being burned from the inside.
Yeah, and that's something I like about novels. I mean, I think everybody's mileage is going to vary,
right?
And
that's what I mean. It's not necessarily.
This isn't going to be for everyone. Like I said, like this. That's why I felt like this book was made for me, because I am someone who can handle that kind of stuff.
Right.
It doesn't bring up past trauma to me like it might for other people.
Yes.
So for me, like I think, but it goes back to something that why I always find books to be. And you can disagree with this, obviously, but I find it to be the most visceral, like, experience you can have in entertainment, because there's like you can't put that on screen, not really.
Well, you can't put the internal.
Yeah, and that's what I'm going to be really interested to see how much of this comes across in the show, because
I can almost guarantee that this scene won't be in the show.
Well,
in this capacity.
I bet there'll be some sort of version of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, but like that particular detail won't be in there.
Yeah.
But that's my point. Like books, you also can get away with more, and you have more freedom to do things like this.
And I will say that like I'm all for taking it to the limit and doing it all. Yeah. And like you say, it's not personally affecting. I just feel that it's worth mentioning that it's like it's definitely something that some people will be offended by, and like you say, it's not for everyone. And
it reminds me of our Clive Barker, which we just did coverage, where Clive Barker is someone who won't let you look away, and he's going to tell you all these details you don't want to hear. And I felt like he was doing that a bit here.
Yeah.
And he was not letting you look away from this torture scene. He wasn't, although it's interesting because he does actually have this moment where he is like imagining his friend talking to him and stuff, and like, we get an impression that that's how he's getting through it, is he is kind of dissociating from it. But still, like, you get these details and he doesn't gloss over them. And I think that's something for like hard-boiled dark fiction that I really like, is that's like a hallmark of it. When people talk about that kind of, is that it's gritty and it's real and it doesn't shy away from things like that.
Right. Yeah.
And if you write a sex scene with as much explicit detail as he's going to do, then as soon as you read, like when I read that sex scene, I knew that like the violence was going to be described in the same way.
Right.
Because it's like it's a contract with the reader. And it's like explicit, every detail, every gory, sticky, whatever detail, you're going to get it all.
Yeah.
And if that's your bag, then you're going to love this.
Right.
If not, then you probably shouldn't read this book.
And I mean, I'm all for the artist, or in this case, the writer. Like I don't want them to pull their punches. Like if this is what they feel, I don't want them to pull their punches.
And a lot of writers do. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like it's a lot of writers wouldn't write this novel this way.
Right.
But I respect that he does, and I as a writer, I feel like that's more my style too. Like I aspire to this kind of detail, and I know going into it that some people, it'll turn some people away, but it'll also, like, there are also people like me who appreciate that too, because it's, like I said, to me it elevates writing in a way that you can't get anywhere else. Like you can't get that intimacy to detail in any other art form, in my opinion, like you can through reading a book. So anyway, you're right, it's worth talking about, and I think it's really interesting. And if you've gotten to this point, maybe that's something to consider if you're considering reading this novel. Can you handle that kind of stuff? Because it's a really graphic torture scene. But yeah, let's move on. So he eventually is able to kind of con his way out of the clinic, and with like talking about his, like, playing his envoy card, and we find out that they are thinking he is a person named Riker, which we learn is because the person whose body he's in is Riker, and so when they see this body, they're like, "You're Riker,"
who was a cop. And so he was a cop. So like they're in the underbelly. So they're like, "Oh my God, he's coming after us."
Who was investigating them? Yeah. Right. So they thought like, "Oh, you're this cop who was sniffing around again." So he eventually is able to convince them, though, that he's got this envoy training, and that's like this big deal. Like it actually scares them enough to where they're gonna like take him to see someone else, and he's gonna have to plead his case, right? And then on his way out, he is able to murder everybody in the car with him, and have the guy drop him off, and he escapes.
Oh, that's something else that I feel like we should have mentioned, is that like the action in this is really fun, really well described. Yeah. And it's like there were action scenes in Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, and these reminded me a lot of that, specifically like the fighting in the car. That's a scene that happens basically kind of in Do Androids Dream. And I just had a lot of fun with all the fight scenes. Like I feel like that's also another thing that's kind of hard to write, because it's like to get your bearings and know where you're at and what's happening within the fight is tough.
Yeah, it's very tough. And he does it well. And yeah, so so speaking of that, he goes on what I thought was just a super fun, like, revenge, which, like, I'm a sucker for this kind of thing, and I identify it and know what it is, but it's just like a revenge kick. And he goes back and he kills everybody.
It reminded me of the end of Django Unchained, where he's just like,
right?
All of these things have happened, and he's like, I'm going back and I'm like brutally gonna kill everyone, and it's gonna be this epic like hero's moment.
Yeah, he goes back to Jerry's. He kills everybody there except for Jerry. He gets Jerry and like convinces him he's going to kill him unless he takes him to the clinic where he was tortured, because he wants to go see the people at the clinic. Jerry takes him to the clinic, and gets him all the way in to like meet the people who were behind it all. And then once he gets him in there, then he just kills everybody, including Jerry. And this is all, by the way, real deaths, which is important. Like he kills people and then he fries their stacks.
Yeah.
So they're really dead. And we learn later that he ends up killing 17 people in this like rampage.
Yeah, he went off. He was going off. He was like, I'm killing everybody. Well, I mean, these are the people who brutally tortured him, and like that's. I mean, you could say that the punishment matches the crime in this situation. Like he.
Yeah, but he does add that interesting layer of where it's gray, because he also kills like Jerry's guards who are just being paid to be there.
True.
He also kills a bunch of people who work at this clinic as like staff and aren't necessarily the people directly responsible for it. And like, what kind of culpability do they share? You know, it's a very like, you know, maybe there's some interesting, like, instead of like trying to determine levels of guilt for everybody gets the same punishment. You know what I mean? Like,
well, they're all working at that sick and twisted clinic or working for bad people. Yeah. So he probably just assumes that these people aren't, you know, and like you say, it is a gray area, but he makes that decision. He decides he's Judge, Jury, and he decides he's Judge, Judy, and executioner. To quote Hot Fuzz.
Yeah, Judge Judy goes off, kills everybody, and then we get some of the aftermath of that, which is him back at the Bancroft estate, and Bancroft is pissed at him because he's had to pay off the triads. He's had to pay off the police. He's had to pay all this money to keep him from being arrested for doing this. And but this is kind of an interesting debriefing moment too, where he talks about like what he's learned, and Bancroft comes clean about like some of these, you know, the prostitutes and kind of his philosophy about his marriage. And it is also important to note that Kovacs has slept with Miriam, had like raunchy sex with her many times, and she is like kind of like being coy and like making these hints when she's around, but it's making Takashi nervous because he thinks, at least, and I don't know if you think or not, but like Bancroft, at least at first blush, doesn't seem to know. And so there's this like secret now too between them where he's had this affair with his wife.
Right. And I mean, it's basically like you have to think about in like a normal story of this style, if you're hired by the big rich guy and then you sleep with his wife, like you're sleeping with the fishes soon, right? And like he's in a situation where he's talking about like the sexual nature of being as old as he is and being in a relationship that long and staying together. And he basically just talks about how he knows that his wife has affairs with other men and he has affairs with other women and goes to see prostitutes, and just kind of talks about that. And which leads us to maybe, do you think that he knows that Kovacs slept with Miss?
Yeah. I kind of don't think he actually knows. And what's interesting, because what you're saying gives us the implication that like he wouldn't be too, like he would be okay with it, like because he's not super protective of her and like, or possessive of her, I should say,
right,
in that way. But does that apply to this situation where it's the man he hired to investigate his murder? Like I also feel like there's something there. I suspect that when he does find out, because I think he will, I don't know that he's going to handle it well, and I'm going to be really interested to see how he responds.
Well, especially because he holds Kovacs' like life in his hands. He can be like, "You're going back to the stack," and then he's fucked.
Yeah, and it's interesting because like Miriam also has a lot of power, and she says like, "I can hide you, and I can pay you the money myself, and I can protect you from my husband." So now he's kind of caught up in this really interesting web with these two ancient beings, and I don't know, that's really cool to me. Like I said, this story is just really fascinating, and there's beyond all the cool tech, it's just it's a really cool mystery story that is very unique to me.
Yeah.
So we also I want to point out a couple other important characters that are talked about. For one, there is a daughter who witnessed something, found the body at least. One of his many children. He's just said to have like 30 something children or 50 children or something. I can't remember how many. But one of them who actually lived at the house found the body, and she's in psychosurgery right now, recovering from whatever she saw. Which psychosurgery we understand is like if you have some sort of mental trauma that's the only way to like repair you. And she hasn't done anything real important yet, but she's been referenced, and I think she's going to be important in the second half of the novel because at some point I think he's going to talk to her and she's going to know something. That's my suspicion. And the assassin who tried to abduct him gets interviewed in a really interesting scene too. So they're interviewing him in virtual reality.
Well, yeah. So after Kovacs meets with the Bancrofts, basically right after that, he goes and meets with Ortega. And he and Ortega go and like you're saying, they go and like basically interrogate this guy in VR.
Yeah, and also he reveals that, or it's revealed that Riker, whose body he's in, was Kristen Ortega's partner, and that's part of why she's been like helping him out and stuff. Is she's like trying to protect that sleeve,
yeah,
because she wants it to be like intact for him when he comes out, because he was put in the storage for corruption.
We also assume that they were together in some way, right? Or at least I did.
It seems like
romantically involved.
I don't know. It could all just be they were partners, and she, I'm not really sure if it was a romantic thing or not. But regardless, so they've got this interesting relationship because of that. And anyway, so she pretends like he is Riker for like a lot of this legal stuff. Not for this part, though, because when they go to talk to the lawyer, she does. But here, yeah, he interviews this guy, and what's really interesting about this guy is he's been doing this for so long, and he copies himself into multiple bodies, that he is said to not really have like a personal identity. And so he appears as this like chimera of all these different people, and he has like claws, and he has all this like weird enhancements in this virtual world. So this is how he views himself.
Yeah, I thought this was really cool.
It's really cool, and he's this really like, I mean, I'm fascinated by this guy because he is or a thing, I guess you could call him. Is he even a guy at this point? I don't know.
And he's obviously another suspicious figure because he was basically sicked on Kovacs very early on.
This is Kovacs' main clue that something is going on here, because somebody who knows who sent him, and he's not revealing who it is.
So obviously,
but why would this happen if Bancroft killed himself?
Exactly.
Yeah. So, but yeah, this guy is like, he's not going to be interrogated. He's not going to be intimidated. Like he's impenetrable. And so they go to his lawyer and they find out they trick his lawyer into thinking they know something. And so the lawyer makes some calls, and then they're able to trace the calls. And this is kind of where we left off at the end of chapter 18, right?
Right. Within this whole like meeting with the lawyer and all that stuff, Kovacs is posing as Riker, and Ortega is referring to him as Riker. They get there, and there's like this interesting exchange where he kind of outsmarts this lawyer, and they're able to what I got out of it is they kind of tapped his phone or his feed or something. They could see the calls that were going to be coming in and out.
Yeah.
And then after they left, they went to dinner together, Ortega and Kovacs. Just a friendly thing. They were just talking about their childhoods and upbringing and home worlds. And then we get this crazy thing where she says that there were whale scientists who... Yeah. I just wanted to mention this because it was so wild. Apparently, whale scientists were able to eventually communicate with whales, and whales told people about the original Martians who came to Earth, which I thought was awesome.
It's really cool. Like I'm interested to know like how important this is for the novel going forward. But yeah, it's just like this little detail that gets thrown out. Like, oh yeah, of course, the whales told us about the Martians, who are like an extinct alien race that once lived on Mars, and like all their stuff was buried or something.
Yeah.
Really cool, interesting thing. And then, the whales being these intelligence beings who can talk, it's really fascinating.
And then we get Ortega getting a phone call at that dinner, and she kind of is like vague about it, but he's like, who was this lawyer reaching out to? And we find out the lawyer was reaching out to Bancroft. So now the lawyer that they're investigating.
Well, no, not necessarily Bancroft. He made a call to the Bancroft residence.
Okay. Yeah, that's true.
So somebody at the Bancroft residence is in connection with the lawyer who's representing the hired man who tried to kidnap him earlier, who's his like one piece of evidence. Which
could mean any number of things, but it's definitely a clue and something that's happening, and that's basically right where we leave off. Yeah,
that's where we leave off. So I think, unless you can think of any other like major characters I haven't talked about yet, I think we have all our main players out on the table right now that we know of, at least, right?
Yeah.
So why is Elizabeth Elliot killed?
I mean, it's a good question because I don't think that we're really given quite enough clues to put it all together yet.
Because Jerry kills her, right? Or has her killed.
Right, but we don't know for what reason. So I assume that it all comes back to this whole Bancroft thing is obviously it like to set up the story like this and not have it all be like connected and to have the prostitution and Bancroft being the major points of contention wouldn't really make sense. So I think basically she was killed because she either did something like either Bancroft is being like he's not being truthful about his feelings towards sexual relations. Maybe he was jealous. Maybe there was something that went on, like she heard something she wasn't supposed to hear. Maybe she was trying to leverage him.
So you think that Bancroft had her killed somehow?
Not necessarily. I just think that she was killed for being in the position that she was in. So I think that her being a prostitute and being involved in that world ultimately got her killed. I don't think it was necessarily...
Jerry didn't want her to leave because she was going to leave or something like.
Because there was something about exclusive something, and they were talking about how he was unhappy with like something that she wanted to happen, and I'm assuming it had something to do with her leaving with Bancroft or doing something.
Well, we know that her father blames Bancroft for her death.
Right. So I mean, those are the hints that were given. So I don't know how to piece that together. I just think that like all the pieces are out there, and then we're gonna have to see it play out next week.
Yeah, so I mean, I think just to end, I just wanted to ask you what you think is actually happening. I mean, and obviously we don't know. Just if you wanted to take a moment to theorize from the information we've been given and the people we've seen, who you think is maybe guilty, who you think is maybe suspicious, and what you think is going on here. If you want to take a stab at it.
I mean, I definitely think like I basically all the stuff that I just said basically goes into my final theory. Is just like there's something with Bancroft and the prostitution ring. That's ultimately going to lead into something else. And I think to have it be just this, because I think there's two sides to this story. I think we're getting the very, very wealthy and the underbelly and the very, very poor. So I think those two things are going to like merge together, and we're going to get something going on with like wealthy, powerful people and poor underbelly people, and some, I don't know, amalgamation of those two things is going to ultimately lead into why he was killed. So
if you had, okay, so you have $50 and you're going to bet it on one person you think is ultimately responsible. Who do you put it on?
Shit, man. I don't know. I think there's so many red herrings at this point. We're just not far enough into the story. But if I had to put $50 on somebody who did it, I would say it's not somebody that we think. I would say it's somebody powerful. It's not going to be somebody who's like a prostitute, potentially. It's not going to be a prostitute because they got in through his defenses and they killed him in his house with all of his guards and all of his technology and all that stuff. So I think it's got to be some sort of hit or something like that.
Okay.
Associated with the ring of prostitution. What do you think?
So my initial thoughts was Miriam. I think she's very suspicious, like we said. But
I also think she's the red herring.
Ultimately, yes, I think she's the red herring. And I think we're supposed to think it's her, essentially, right?
Right.
And I also think that the person who's done it has been introduced at this point, and I think it is the daughter. I think the daughter is the one who's behind it. And
the psycho
who is currently getting psychosurgery or whatever. So she's been introduced, but not been like, we haven't dealt much with her. So she's been introduced in a way that we kind of think is like, okay, she's here, but she's not important, which I think psychologically direct like moves our stuff away from her. I think she's going to get interviewed at some point, and she's going to have a really convincing story about what happened, but it's going to be some sort of, I think ultimately it's going to end up being a fake, and that she is actually the one who is behind it, and maybe her finding the body and needing this surgery was like a cover, you know what I mean, to cover her involvement.
I mean, I hadn't even thought of that, dude. I think you're definitely in the right like frame of mind there. I think you've got it, because she would be on the inside. She wouldn't have to break through all the defenses.
Yeah, so I feel like she's like nestled in there kind of secretively and could potentially be the one who's behind it. But I will say, good mysteries also often evade this sort of thinking, because they're, people are often several steps ahead of you. So I will not be shocked at all if I end up being completely wrong. I could definitely be completely wrong.
Oh yeah, I have no idea.
And maybe she's a second red herring that we're eventually going to be led to think is it, and then it'll end up being something else. And maybe it's the maid who briefly got mentioned who wasn't given a name. You know what I mean? Like, who knows?
Yeah.
Or this guy she's playing tennis with at one point, and like, because right at this last chapter we get introduced to some politicians and stuff. Maybe it was a political hit. Who knows? There's a lot of options on the table. I'm just saying, if I had to put money, that's where my money goes. But I certainly am not certain that that's where it is.
Yeah, I like that for sure.
Okay, cool, man. I think that's it. I mean, we tried this new format out. If you liked it, definitely let us know, because this is something we might consider doing for future projects, especially if time's an issue and we can't get into everything. I still felt like we were able to talk about all the major points we wanted to talk about. So if you enjoyed this format, reach out to us, inktofilm@gmail.com is where you can email us with any feedback. You also can just tell us general feedback about this book. If you've read it, we'd love to hear from you. If you're, because we don't spoil anything in the second half, I guess is our one request, because we're going to be reading that. But we'd love to hear from you and let us know that we're covering something that you have read and are interested in.
Yeah, definitely. And if you want to reach out in any other way, we are on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, @inktofilm on all those. Send us messages about the podcast theories that you guys have if you're following along with us. We're pretty active on there, so anything you want to send our way, go ahead and do it.
Yeah, please do. Also, speaking of social media, on Facebook, you can leave us reviews on our podcast page. But you also can leave reviews on iTunes or wherever you download this podcast. And if you were to do that, it's a huge help for us. It can help us continue to grow, help us keep going. And you can leave us a review like this one, which comes from our Facebook page. 5 stars from Alex. Luke and James do a great job of unpacking the books and films that are paired in each series of podcasts. This was something that I've always looked for in a podcast, in the podcast world, and could never find anything that quite matched it. Give them a try. So listen to Alex. Give us a try. Give us a review. Thanks a lot, Alex.
We also want to say thank you to Audible for giving us our affiliate link. It's, again, audibletrial.com/ink2film. And that'll give you 30 free days to Audible, and you can get a free credit for any audiobook in their collection.
Yeah, and if you've listened this long and you haven't read this book, use it on this one, because hopefully we've convinced you by now that this is a book you should check out.
Yeah, it's really fun so far. We also wanted to say thank you to Ross Bugden for the use of our intro and outro music.
All right, I guess that's it. Thanks for listening, and we will be back next week with the second half of this novel. Look forward to it. Until then, I'm Luke.
And I'm James.
See ya.